Good day. 2 videos ago, I did a program in which I referred to the Russian strategy, the current Russian strategy in the war in Ukraine, as one of aggressive attrition. The Russians launching attacks all along the front line, launching missile strikes all across Ukraine, not in support of some offensive at the present time, intended to defeat Ukraine in some great tactical, strategic battle, but intended to wear the Ukrainians down, to deplete their forces, to deplete their weapon systems, to break their industrial and economic base, and also to exhaust the West's capacity to keep on supporting Ukraine week after week, month after month, in a war where even the West is starting to understand that the Russians inevitably are going to win. Now, I said that about 2 days ago, and we've now had another speech by the Russian defense minister at the Russian Defense Ministry Board, and fascinatingly, he too seemed to define the Russian approach very much as in the terms of aggressive attrition in the way that I discussed. Let me just read the opening speech that he made to this meeting of the Defense Ministry Board. I'm taking this again from the official translation provided by the Russian Defense Ministry. The speech is relatively short, and as I said, I can cover it fully. And this is what Shoigu said, and he spoke early this morning, January 9th. Today, we are holding the first thematic teleconference of the year. I would like once again to congratulate all personnel on New Year's Day and thank all those who during the holiday served on combat duty as part of duty shifts and daily assignments, performed tasks in military hospitals, and established peaceful life in new regions. Special words of gratitude to Russian fighting comrades who all this time acted professionally and selflessly on the front lines. Now, I just make one quick observation here. It's one that I made before. There was a fair amount of speculation a couple of days ago that the Russians would declare a unilateral Christmas truce, as they did last year. They didn't do so. There was no announcement of any Christmas truce by President Putin or by the Russian Defense Ministry. And here we see Shoigu thanking the Russian military, or rather Russian soldiers, who conducted their work during the holiday, as he puts it, professionally and selflessly on the front line, despite the fact that it is, for most Russians, the overwhelming majority of Russians, both a public and a religious holiday. Anyway, Shoigu then goes on to discuss the conduct of the war, and these are the points he makes in which in my opinion, describe the strategy of aggressive attrition that I spoke about before. Russian groups of forces are methodically reducing the combat potential of the armed forces of Ukraine. Over the past year, he's clearly referring to 2023, enemy losses have exceeded 215,000 troops and 28,000 weapons. 215,000 troops, let me reiterate again, that clearly includes both dead and wounded. I think there's been much misunderstanding and continues to be some misunderstanding about this. There are routine claims, for example, that the Russian Defense Ministry overstates Ukrainian casualties. That may be true, but I think that the assumption that many people who make that claim are working under is that when the Russians give figures, both in their daily briefings and in these figures that Shoigu has just provided, they're speaking of enemy soldiers killed, whereas it's absolutely clear to me, and has been confirmed by other Russian officials, including Putin himself, that the Russians are talking about killed and wounded. Just say, we retain the strategic initiative along the entire line of contact. Despite the depletion of human resources of Ukrainian formations and the lack of results on the battlefield, the United States is cold-bloodedly trying to realize its ambitions for world leadership at the expense of Ukrainians. At the behest of its Western handlers, the Kiev regime continues to slaughter its soldiers and is looking for any opportunity to replenish the ranks of the Ukrainian army. Of course, this will not change the situation on the line of contact, but will prolong the military conflict. Let's continue to achieve the goal of the special military operation. Now, I would suggest that what we've just heard is, in fact, a straightforward description of aggressive attrition. We retain the strategic initiative along the entire line of contact. So the Russians are attacking, they're pushing the Ukrainians forward, but note that nowhere in these words does Shoigu speak of the Russians being on the offensive. They have the initiative, they are attacking, but it is not an offensive strategy, at least not for the moment. And then he goes on to explain what the purpose is: the depletion of human resources of Ukrainian formations. And this is precisely what the Russians are doing. They are methodically reducing the combat potential of the armed forces of Ukraine. And they have inflicted, this is according to Shoigu, more than 215,000 casualties on the Ukrainians, dead and wounded, over the course of 2023. So the purpose is to deplete the Ukrainian resources, deplete their human resources, deplete the human resources of Ukrainian formations. Those are, again, Shoigu's words, and this is the strategy. The Russians are doing that by methodically reducing the combat potential of the armed forces of Ukraine. Now, they conducted this policy of attrition when they were on the defensive in the summer, during Ukraine's summer counteroffensive. They conducted this policy of attrition last winter and spring in the Battle of Bakhmut, and they are continuing to conduct it now. They hold the strategic initiative, but the purpose is fundamentally, the only purpose, in fact, that Shoigu is providing in these words is the methodical reduction of the combat potential of the armed forces of Ukraine. And this is being achieved through the depletion, first and foremost, through the depletion of its human resources. Now, there are other factors, of course, as well at play, and there are tactical aspects. The fact that the West is struggling to make up weapons supplies to Ukraine. For example, I've discussed the crisis Ukraine is experiencing in the supply of shells. The Ukrainians are admitting this. Much commentary in the West admits this as well. I've discussed in recent programs the catastrophic collapse of Ukraine's air defense system. The fact that 3 massive Russian missile strikes appear to have inflicted colossal damage on this air defense system. It is proving very difficult, perhaps impossible, for the West to patch it up And probably the resources of the West are not equal to that task anyway. So the Russians are depleting Ukraine's equipment, inventory in this fashion. They're also, by the way, depleting the West's depletement inventory, but they are also heavily focused on depleting Ukraine's human resources, the human resources of the Ukrainian armed forces. And Shoigu acknowledges the fact that Ukraine is about to conduct what looks like a further mobilization. There's been many reports, much talk that the mobilization law will finally be signed off some point over the next couple of days. Ukraine will try to call up 500,000 men. It's trying to put pressure on some of the people who have left Ukraine and find themselves in Europe to come back and serve in the army. Zelensky himself is making fierce comments. He says that the time has come for people to ask themselves the question, are they citizens of Ukraine or are they refugees? A foolish question to ask, by the way, because most of them will probably say that they're refugees rather than citizens, given that the primary reason they have left Ukraine in the first place, I suspect, or at least in many cases, is precisely to avoid service in the Ukrainian army. But anyway, put that aside. He says that yes, the Western powers, the Ukrainian government, continue to slaughter their soldiers. This is the offensive strategy that Ukraine has been conducting over the last year. And also, when it comes up, the defensive strategy of trying to defend every millimeter of ground, be it in Mariupol, be it in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, be it in Bakhmut, be it in Marinka, be it now currently in Avdiivka, be it in Novomikhailovka, be it in any one of these places, Ukraine resisting any suggestion of retreats, trying to defend wherever it can, and trying to attack whenever it can. And the result, according to Shoigu, is slaughter of Ukraine's soldiers. We're seeing more of that going on at the moment in Krinky, for example, the bridgehead on the east bank of the Dnieper. And Shoigu acknowledges that they're looking for any opportunity to replenish the ranks of the Ukrainian army through this mobilization process. But then he goes on to say this will not change the situation on the line of contact. In other words, if Ukraine does call up hundreds of thousands of men, it's not going to lead to any kind of breakthrough. It's not even going to slow the Russians down, not in any significant way. It's not going to stop the Russians continuing to conduct aggressive attrition. But what it will do is prolong the conflict at the cost of many more Ukrainian lives. And he goes on to say, let us continue to consistently achieve the goal of the special military operation. And then, as is his way, Shoigu turns to technical matters, and he says that the Russian military leadership has now set itself certain priority and systemic tasks. And perhaps it's interesting again to quote the actual paragraph. Again, this is an English translation provided by the Russian Ministry of Defense. The actual paragraph Shoigu uses, given the nature of the military threats and politico-military risks. Notice this interesting combination, politico-military risks. As we have been saying on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, from the outset of the conflict, or at least the current iteration of the conflict, in February 2022, Russian strategy is always based, Russian war strategy is always based on thinking about war essentially and ultimately as a special kind of political process, a concept known to the West through the writings of Clausewitz, but arguably native to Russian military thinking, regardless of Clausewitz himself. But anyway, given the nature of military threats and political military risks, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, which is of course a way of referring to Putin, has set a number of priority and systemic tasks. Now, referring to Putin as Supreme Commander-in-Chief is again an interesting formulation because of course it references Putin himself. It speaks of Putin as the overall head of the Russian armed forces. But I'm going to suggest that referring to him in that way, without identifying him by name, without speaking of him as the president of the country, talking about him as the supreme commander-in-chief, takes us back to that concept, the concept of the Stavka, which I've discussed in previous programs, based principally on the things that John Helmer has been writing about Stavka, and which have also, to some extent, been further elaborated by people like Andrei Martyanov. It's not just Putin who's come along and has set these priority and systemic tasks. Clearly, this is a decision by the overall leadership of the Russian armed forces, and not just the Russian armed forces, because given that in Russia, military affairs are understood to be a particular branch of politics, the Russian political and military leadership is integrated to a degree that is simply not understood in the West. So there's been coming together, as I said, of people who've been thinking about the kind of things that the Russian military needs to do, and it's been assigned tasks, and Shoigu then tells us what those tasks are. One of the key ones is to keep the nuclear triad at the highest level of operational readiness, which ensures the strategic balance in the world. So that remains the overriding priority. It has been the main priority ever since President Putin came to power in 1999, first as acting prime minister and then as president in 2000. And for a very long time, in fact, to the extent that the Russians developed their military at all in the first decade or so of President Putin's rule, the overwhelming emphasis was on rebuilding, reconstituting, and enlarging and strengthening Russia's strategic triad. And of course, that is what they're doing. They're developing new bombers, Tupolev 160, which is now re-entering production. There's reports that a more advanced bomber is now in high level of development. We have confirmation that the Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile is now in operation as well. Has now apparently completed its field tests. It's entering series production. It's the most advanced intercontinental bomber, intercontinental ballistic missile in existence. We also have a steady strengthening of Russia's submarine deterrent force with the development of the Borei submarines, nuclear submarines, with their Bulava sea-launched ballistic missiles, which are able to reach the United States. And There are lots of rumors of all kinds of other weapons coming into service as well. The Avant-Garde hypersonic glide vehicle is apparently already in service. This is a strategic system, immeasurably more powerful than the Kinjal and the Zircon hypersonic missiles that I've talked about. And there are lots of rumors that the first of the Khabarovsk class nuclear-powered submarines is now undergoing trials, and it will be the main submarine, that class of submarines, that will operate the Status 6, the Poseidon nuclear-powered torpedo that I have discussed many times in programs, mostly programs that I did before the start of the conflict in Ukraine. And of course, there are many other aspects to the strategic triad, satellite reconnaissance, communications, and all those kind of things. But anyway, that remains the priority. Everything else is secondary to that overriding priority. But coming back to the rest of what Putin said, Shoigu said, goes on to say, we will continue to equip the armed forces with the most modern weapons, including those based on artificial intelligence, technologies, and new physical principles. New physical principles? Who knows? Laser weapons, other types of weapons. I'm not going to try and speculate. AI technologies, apparently they're starting to appear in drone warfare. Drones are being operated using AI systems. There's already word that some drones have some kind of AI systems functioning. And some of Russia's air defense missiles, the S-350 system, for example, it seems are also now operating with some level of AI technology integrated as well. But then Shoigu deals specifically with the situation of the Russian military that's fighting in the conflict in Ukraine. He says we will also focus on the comprehensive supply of troops participating in the special military operation. We will increase supply of the most demanded samples. Shells, missiles, tanks, everything. We will continue to increase supply. But then he specifically talks about drones. In particular, to form a serial line of unmanned aerial vehicles from ultra-small to heavy strike aircraft. Now, many people have commented about the fact that in the drone war that is being fought over Ukraine, the Russians have principally focused on small drones. And in fact, these have been perhaps the single most decisive part of the drone war up to now, and they're by far the most common drones operating in the battlefronts. And it's clear, at least to me, that the importance of these small drones like the Lancet, kamikaze drone, FPV drones, which are being used very effectively by both sides as a kind of long-range sniper artillery type system. Orlan 10 drones, which act as surveillance drones on the battlefields, and any number of other drones as well. Anyway, clearly the emphasis has been up to now on small drones. But Shoigu is telling us that bigger drones more like the Predator and the Reaper, presumably, and perhaps jet-powered drones. And we know that the Russians have been working on jet-powered drones. They have shown early examples of such drones working alongside the Sukhoi 57. Anyway, those type of heavy strike drones, the Russians are intending to establish production of drones that will cover the entire range, from the smallest all the way to the heaviest. And I'm going to suggest that just as 2023 was the year where we saw the smaller drones, the Lancets and the Orlan 10s and the FPV drones, those kind of drones come into their own, probably over the course of 2024. We will start to see the bigger, heavier drones also starting to make much more of an appearance on the battlefronts as well. Many people have asked why the Russians have not deployed more of these heavy drones up to now, why they've not deployed drones like the Orion, for example, and the Sirius, and maybe the Altius B, all of these drones, which to some extent reproduce the character of some of the American drones that we all know about, the Reaper and the Global Hawk and all the others. I am going to suggest quite simply that the priority last year was to get production of strike drones, kamikaze drones, Lancet drones, Geranium-2 drones, Orlan 10 surveillance drones, those kind of drones, to sort out the production of those drones, to build the factories, to perfect the designs, to get the production lines working, to train the operators. And that work having been done, and these were in some respects the most vitally necessary drones of all, now the Russians are able to move up and start building in larger numbers and deploying on the battlefields the bigger drones. And I suspect we're going to start to see them increasingly operating on the battlefronts. And he then talks about our immediate plans, and notice that this is an immediate plan, so this is a particularly high priority issue, including improving the communication system, increasing the effectiveness of modern reconnaissance, target designation, counter-battery warfare, as well as air defense and satellite capabilities. This is the whole area of surveillance, of information control, of data analysis, of information obtained from the battlefront. Simplicius the thinker in particular writes massively about this. The Russians talk about it too. The Russian Defense Ministry talks about it. True, there have been comments by Russian officials, including no less a person than President Putin himself, saying that in terms of satellite reconnaissance, for example, of the Ukrainian battlefronts, the Western powers completely outmatch the Russians. They have far more satellites observing what's going on the battlefronts than the Russians do. Now, the Russians probably do not need as many satellites as the West does. There's a huge amount of duplication, one suspects. One imagines that, the British will have their satellites, and the French will have their satellites, and of course the Americans also will have their satellites. The Russians don't need to match the West, satellite for satellite. But over the last few months, there has been a quiet uptick in Russian launches of military satellites. And gradually, steadily, the Russians will be improving their observation of the Ukrainian battlefronts with their satellites, and of course, all the other target designation and communication systems that Shoigu is talking about here, areas where the Russians have found themselves to be behind the West, as has been widely acknowledged, and anyway, they appear to be working on that. And Shoigu goes on to say, we will continue to use the experience gained during the special military operation in combat training and in the educational process at military universities and academies, and actively involve instructors with combat skills in working with servicemen. Even the British Ministry of Defence has conceded that the Russians, over the last 2 years or so, have used information, experience that they've gained from the special military operation to train fresh officers, to improve training of troops. And the British Ministry of Defence unusually recently admitted that over the next few years, the number of officers with combat experience will have grown hugely in the Russian army, and the number of officers trained on the basis of that combat experience will have increased also massively in the Russian army. And sooner or later, that will change its character. It will change and develop the character of the Russian military. It will become more sophisticated and more combat ready than it was. Gordon Hahn, very astute commentator that he is, and someone, incidentally, who, to my knowledge, comes from a military family in the United States, says that he anticipates that at the end of the special military operation, the Russians will have the best educated, most battle-hardened military in the world. And, well, we'll see whether or not that turns out to be the case. But Shoigu's words, if we are to take them seriously, which, by the way, we most emphatically should, anyway, that points clearly in that direction. And then Shoigu finishes up by talking about things like social guarantees and welfare payments for soldiers, very important to serving soldiers, but I'm going to skip that part of his comments. So, aggressive attrition is the name of the game. It is what the Russians are currently doing in Ukraine. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, if President Zelensky's fantastic plan of a new Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region, across the Dnieper River, trying to battle through line after line of Russian defenses to try to reach Crimea, despite the obstacle of the Dnieper River lying between the Ukrainian frontline troops and their logistic bases. If this fantastic, ludicrous plan is indeed what the Ukrainians try to implement at some point over the course of the next few months, ignoring advice from the United States, not that American advice up to now has been particularly good, and avoiding the battlefield advice of some of their best commanders, which has been accepted by the overall commander-in-chief, General Zelensky. Well, if the Ukrainians do go forward with such a foolish plan, then the Russians will say to themselves, this is exactly what we want. It gives us more opportunities to conduct even more attrition against the Ukrainians. And as the summer offensive demonstrated, when the Ukrainians go on the attack and the Russians remain on the defense, Ukrainian losses skyrocket and Russian losses fall. During the August fighting, Russian losses were amongst the lowest recorded during the Cold War, or during the entire conflict, rather. We have the tracking of losses by the Media Zona organization to show that. And given that that is so, from a Russian perspective, this would be perfect, a perfect form of conducting further attrition. Now, I think that this is increasingly coming to be understood by more and more people, both in Ukraine and in the West. But let me reiterate once again that, for the moment at least, the Russians are conducting an attrition strategy. At present, it is an aggressive attrition strategy. The Russians, as Shoigu says, have the initiative on all the front lines. They're attacking everywhere that they can, but their purpose is to deplete and degrade the Ukrainian military. If the Ukrainians go on the attack, then the Russians will implement a defensive attrition strategy. But either way, their policy at the moment is attrition, and they have the means to execute on it. And it is the strategy that is working for them, and for the moment at least, they're sticking to it. So there we go. A very interesting set of comments by Shoigu, amongst the most revealing he has ever given, in my opinion, or at least given since the start of the special military operation almost 2 years ago. So there we go. That was Shoigu. Now, I said that there is growing awareness of much of this in the West. And this, of course, brings me to some commentaries that have now appeared in the West. The first I will turn to, and by the way, I should say that I've got a lot of this information again as a result of the links that Jeff Roberts, the historian, circulates to many people. He's provided links to various articles. Some of them I'm familiar with already, but not all of them by any means. And anyway, I'm the fortunate recipient among several people of these links. Anyway, Jeff Roberts has provided various links, and one of them is to the opening chapter of a new book written by the Swiss military and intelligence officer Jacques Beau. And Jacques Beau has provided an account of the Russian way of war. It appears to be a most interesting book that Jacques Beau has written, and one does get a sense that Jacques Beau at least grasps some of what it is that the Russians are actually doing, that they're conducting war in the kind of way that I've discussed, pursuing essentially an attrition strategy. And Jacques Beau has provided an outline of the way in which the Russians have shown a readiness on many occasions to retreat. Conservation of forces for them is always more important than holding on to territory, and that from time to time the Russians are prepared to retreat, but when opportunities arrive to conduct attrition, that is precisely what they do, and that remains very much the keystone of their strategy. And Jacques Beau makes, well, I think it's a very interesting point, which is that Western thinkers, Western analysts, to a very great extent, still cannot quite grasp this. They're still very accustomed to thinking of war as taking ground, defeating armies, seizing cities, doing those sort of things. And they still, therefore, tend to push the Ukrainians towards conducting war in accordance with these kind of ideas. And the Ukrainians themselves, to a great extent, also assimilated this Western formula of thinking. And so the Ukrainians consistently fall, and the West consistently fall into the traps that the Russians set for them. So Jacques Beau says that Russia operates within the framework of Clausewitzian thinking, in which operational successes are exploited for strategic ends. And he gives an example. He cites the Battle of Bakhmut. The Russians adapted perfectly to the strategy imposed on Ukraine by the West, which prioritizes the defense of every square meter. The Ukrainians thus played into the hands of the attrition strategy officially announced by Russia. Conversely, in Kharkiv and Kherson, the Russians preferred to cede territory in exchange for their lives of their men. In the context of a war of attrition, sacrificing potential in exchange for territory, as Ukraine is doing, is the worst strategy of all. And Jacques Bull makes the point that General Zelensky tried to oppose Zelensky and proposed withdrawing his forces from Bakhmut because he had some understanding of the kind of war that the Russians are fighting. But then Jacques Bull says, but in Ukraine, it is the Western narrative that guides military decisions. Zelensky preferred to follow the path laid out for him by the West's media in order to retain the support of Western opinion. And in November 2023, Zelensky had to openly admit that this decision was a mistake because prolonging the war will only favor Russia. And Bull then goes on to say Ukraine's problem is that it has no rational relationship with the notion of victory. It doesn't really understand how to achieve victory in this war. He cites a speech given by Alexei Danilov, the very powerful and, in my opinion, underestimated Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. And it was a speech that Danilov gave in November, and Bull makes the point that it showed that Ukraine has neither a plan to emerge from the conflict nor an approach that would associate a sense of victory with that emergence. And Bull, at least in this article, says that in Ukraine, the political leadership has locked itself into a Western narrative that precludes a way out of the crisis without losing face. The asymmetrical situation now working to Ukraine's disadvantage stems from a narrative, note the use of the word narrative, that has been confused with reality and has led to a response that is ill-suited to the nature of the Russian operation. Well, all that is from Jacques Bull, and for what it's worth, I think it is absolutely spot on right. But you could argue that Jacques Bull has always been a critic of Western policy with respect to Ukraine. He has been talking and predicting many of these things for a long time. He is very familiar with Russian military thinking. He was, after all, an intelligence officer, someone who's worked in NATO as well. So, it's the sort of thing that you would expect him to research. But every so often we get glimmers of understanding from others as well. And for example, we've had a very interesting article from a Mr. Jonathan Esther. I'm not quite sure who he is, by the way. He's not somebody I've come across before. But anyway, Jonathan Esther discusses in this article, which appears in, again, a website called The Conversation. Again, I won't pretend that I'm very familiar with this particular website. Again, I owe Jeff Roberts the debt for this article. But anyway, Mr. Esther discusses Ukraine's latest mobilization plan. And he points out that in Ukraine, increasingly, the war with Russia is coming to be seen correctly as a rich man's quarrel and a poor man's fight. That the way in which mobilization is being conducted in Ukraine and the way in which it will continue to be conducted is by basically pressing men from the lower demographics into the war to fight a war that is overwhelmingly supported by a small, relatively small demographic that at the same time is not sharing in many of the sacrifices of that war. And the article makes many of the points that have been made before, that this is demographically an extremely bad approach. Birth rates remain very low. Emigration of men of the most skilled and economically active population has accelerated since the war began. This leaves predominantly the poor to do the fighting while seeing their living standards further decline. And forced mobilization, the reduction of rights and freedoms of the population, further economic disruption and social hardship contrast sharply with what is widely perceived as the corruption-fueled lifestyle of an entrenched and unaccountable elite. And the article concedes that within President Zelensky's own circle, there are elements of corruption. There are people who are visibly corrupt, and this is becoming an increasing issue for larger Ukrainian society. And then, rather unrealistically, entirely unrealistically, in my opinion, Mr. Esther talks about how Ukraine needs a new social contract between elites and society as much as it needs a reassessment of its military strategy, yet neither are likely. Well, how does Ukraine, in the middle of a conflict, construct a new social contract? I mean, what is being demanded is a complete reconstitution of Ukrainian society, such as would amount to a revolution in Ukraine. And how realistic is that, or at least how realistic is it to expect that the Ukrainian leadership would be willing to carry out such a revolution? But anyway, he says neither is likely. Zelensky and his foreign minister Dmytro Kuleba insist that there is a path to victory and that they do not have a plan B. This uncompromising position is reflected in the current mobilization plan. And then he goes on to say more men, however, does not constitute a strategy. At best, it can be part of a strategy to justify the undoubted sacrifice that Zelensky is asking of Ukrainian society. He needs to articulate a clearer purpose and direction. Simply reiterating the desirable Ukraine's complete liberation will sooner or later come to be seen in Ukraine and in Western partner capitals as a fantasy, dangerously detached from realities on the ground. Well, of course, this is a case, in some ways, of looking at the back view, at the mirror, and looking backwards, because, of course, we are already there. Many people, both in the West and in Ukraine itself, have already come to the conclusions that Mr. Esther is talking about, that mobilization is not a strategy, and that talk of a renewed offensive at some point in the summer when the F-16s come, a march on Crimea, across the Dnieper, through Kherson region, through all of these huge, elaborate Russian defense lines, is every bit as much of a pipe dream as the summer offensive, the one we've just gone through, has proved to be. Well, there we go. That's Mr. Esther coming to the understanding of this situation. But again, let me repeat a point I have made before. it's difficult to see now how Zelensky and the government around him, the political class around him, can conduct this war now in any other way. If they do what the West demands and go on to the defensive, then in effect they have admitted, they will be forced to admit, the catastrophic mistake they made in allowing the war to take shape in the first place. They should have far more wisely implemented the Minsk agreement, which would have avoided the war altogether, and merely granted autonomy to Donbass. If they weren't going to implement the Minsk agreement and allow the war to happen at all, they should have conceded the Istanbul agreement after all the huge losses that Ukrainian society has already experienced, going on to the defensive now, admitting that ultimate military victory over the Russians is unachievable, will open up a debate within Ukraine, which will inevitably lead to the challenge of President Zelensky, a challenge against President Zelensky himself and his entire administration. In fact, some Ukrainian officials, as I discussed in my previous video, have pointed out that the moment the war ends, elections, presidential elections, have to happen. And if those elections happen in the context of a Ukrainian failure in the war, failure to achieve the victorious objectives that President Zelensky has set, President Zelensky will almost certainly lose, with all the consequences that go with that. So they have to continue to push for further offensives. They have to continue to defend every millimeter of ground. They have to use the F-16s when they come in that kind of way. And of course, by doing that, they are falling straight into the trap, open-eyed into the trap of the policy of aggressive attrition, which in the speech that I discussed at the outset of this program, Shoigu has now described. Anyway, we will see what the Ukrainians do. Now, there's been a lot more information pouring in now about the Russian missile strikes, the latest Russian missile strike on Ukraine, the one that took place on the 8th of January. And it's becoming increasingly clear that once again, it targeted the military-industrial complex. And not just the military-industrial complex, but also transportation corridors, railway links, warehouses, things of that kind. And one of the particular points of focus of this latest attack was, again, the tormented town of Khmelnytsky, the subject of many Russian missile attacks over the course of the last year. There's a massive explosion there. I remember in the run-up to the Ukrainian offensive, there's been more huge explosions. Apparently, factories and warehouses in Khmelnytsky have been destroyed. And apparently one of the reasons for the focus on Khmelnytsky is that it is one of the places through which Western equipment has to pass as it arrives in Ukraine. It's a key logistical and transportation hub, and that makes it a particularly attractive target for the Russians. And Khmelnytsky massively attacked, Dnipro also severely attacked, Kryvyi Rog attacked as well. Interestingly enough, over the course of this latest missile strike, Kiev itself was not attacked, which is interesting, and it suggests to me that the Russians probably feel that they did a huge amount of damage in Kiev, and perhaps they're waiting to see what the West and Ukraine will do with respect to the critical situation in Kiev in terms of its air defense system. Probably they're going to sit back and wait and see how the West and the Ukrainians try to patch things together in Kiev before they launch their next big missile strike and smash everything up all over again, allowing this thing to go on and to continue until eventually the whole position in Kiev and elsewhere in Ukraine in air defense terms becomes completely unsustainable. Anyway, a major missile strike targeting again the air defense system first and foremost. That, I think, now is clearly the Russian priority, but also targeting the military-industrial complex, such as it is within Ukraine, its industrial facilities, its railway lines, its logistics infrastructure, weakening the Ukrainian armed forces, inflicting more and more damage on the flow of Western equipment into Ukraine. And I think a point to make here is that earlier in the war, we were hearing a lot of questions being asked about why don't the Russians attack the trains along which the supplies pass as they come from the west into Ukraine? Why aren't the Russians attacking, knocking out these supply trains? Why aren't the Russians able to interrupt this flow of supplies in the way that perhaps many people expected that they would? Well, again, the answer actually was a very straightforward one. With the Ukrainian air defense system as it existed in 2022, launching that kind of interdiction campaign would have been immensely costly for the Russian Air Force and perhaps would have been impossible. Russian aircraft would have been shot down in large numbers by Ukraine's air defense system, and that would have made that kind of interdiction campaign effectively an unsustainable one. But with the air defense system, Ukraine's air defense system, now progressively breaking down, the Soviet-era air defense system having, to all intents and purposes, now completely broken down, the Western air defense system that was supplied in its place cracking, large gaps increasingly showing, the Russians able to destroy more and more Ukrainian air defense assets. It makes it easier, more possible for the Russians to carry out strikes, airstrikes with aircraft on Ukrainian logistic and transport systems. And it seems to me that the one thing that we can now say with confidence is that long-range missiles are not really the way that you knock out trains and knock out convoys of vehicles and things of that kind. You need aircraft in the air in order to do that. You need jet bombers, Sukhoi 34s, and perhaps and plausibly, you also need heavy drones. Drones like equivalents to the Reaper, jet-powered drones like, as I said, the Russians have already displayed. The very type of drone that Shoigu is now saying the Russians will be producing in volumes over the course of 2024. So that, I think, is coming. We are going to see over the course of 2024, increasing activity by the Russian Air Force across Ukraine, attacking Ukrainian communications, transport corridors, that kind of thing. In many cases, it will be Russian jet aircraft, Sukhoi 34s, principally. But I suspect we're going to see lots of heavy drones now starting to appear, operating deeper inside Ukraine as the air defense system itself becomes, the Ukrainian air defense system becomes increasingly degraded. So you can see how the thinking, that the Russian thinking can be pieced together both from Russian actions on the ground, the attacks on the air defense system, and the comments that Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, are making. I would say once upon a time, there were analysts in the West, in the intelligence services, who would be very skilled at doing precisely that kind of thing. In the old days, that's exactly the kind of work that people like Ray McGovern and Larry Johnson and others like them used to do. I wonder whether that capacity for analysis, at which especially the United States excelled, whether that capacity for analysis in the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, whether that exists anymore. I frankly doubt it. But anyway, that's my own thought. Anyway, moving on. I said that some people in the West have begun to understand Russian approach, this policy of aggressive attrition. I've spoken about Jacques Ball and Mr. Esther, about the fact that the Russian way of war, in many respects, differs from the Western. Of course, there are many others who don't see things in that way at all. And we've had another article. I'm going to briefly reference it. I'm not going to read it. From Hamish de Breton Gordon, I should say Colonel Hamish de Breton Gordon, in the Daily Telegraph. And he was apparently, at one time, presumably during the Cold War, the former commanding officer of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment. So presumably the man who was in overall charge of British tank forces. But again, reading it, it seems to me that Hamish and others like him live in a world that not only doesn't exist today, but is based on profound misunderstandings of the past. Anyway, Hamish, as I will call him, complains that there are Russian surveillance drones flying over Germany, monitoring the training of Ukrainian soldiers there. This is all based upon some strange comment by a Ukrainian MP. I personally don't take that claim seriously. Hamish complains that these Russian drones aren't being shot down. I think if these Russian drones actually existed, they most certainly would have been shot down. The fact that they're not being shot down simply means that they don't exist. But then he goes on to say that we are heading towards a war with the Russians, and he says that that he agrees with the head of Poland's National Security Bureau that NATO has a 3-year window in which to avoid war with Russia. The Kremlin is very clearly fighting a total war against Ukraine and indirectly against NATO, turning tractor factories into tank production and spending 30% of its country's wealth on weapons. This is World War II stuff. I mean, tractor factories churning out tanks. I mean, this wasn't even really true, in fact, during the Second World War. It was true to some extent, but it's based, as I said, on old books written, I think, principally in the 1960s. I can remember them, by the way, talking about how during the Second World War, Stalin converted the Soviet Union's tractor factories into churning out tanks. I mean, I'm not saying this is completely wrong, but the point is, it simply isn't true today. There's nothing like that happening in Russia today. To the extent that the Russian tank production is increasing, it's not increasing because the Russians are converting tractor factories into tank production factories. It is because tank production factories like Ural Vagon Zavod in Nizhny Tagil, the factory in Omsk, they're increasing their production. They have enormous amounts of spare capacity, as I have discussed many times, which makes it possible for them to increase production. In fact, Ural Vagon Zavod has been massively reorganized over the last couple of years. Instead of being just one factory, it is now part of a huge complex of factories, including the one in Omsk, by the way, and the great factories in Chelyabinsk, which have recently been making more civilian products, but which during the period of the Second World War were involved in tank and armored vehicle production. And no doubt they're doing something of that again today. And if you want to understand, you want the Russian military-industrial complex, how tank production, armored vehicle production in Russia is actually organized. Again, the right place to go is not old books from the 1960s, which are the ones that Hamish appears to be reading, and of course the unending reproduction of exactly those books that have been published in the West ever since. It's actually books by people like Jim Kinnair. In fact, specifically Jim Kinnair's books, in which he discusses Russian armored vehicle production, Russian armored vehicle designs. He talks about the factories. I understand he's actually visited some of these factories. He seems to have great knowledge, for example, of the factory in Chelyabinsk, and he's able to discuss production of heavy tanks that took place there. You read his books, he can talk all about this in great detail, and he is in a position to discuss this material extensively. And can I say, I mean, this source, Jim Kinnair, these are open publications. They're available for people to read. I understand that some of these books are now having problems with their publishers because of nervousness about discussing Russian-related matters, especially Russian military-related matters. And instead, we have these fantasies, as I said, from the 1960s, the 50s and 60s, about tractor factories being placed in production. For the record, as I understand it, agricultural machinery production in Russia, including tractor production, is actually increasing. It's not the case of factory space being used to make tanks instead of tractors. Anyway, that's one thing. And of course, what about this? Is Putin spending 30% of its wealth on weapons? Again, a fantastic idea. The Russians are not spending 30% of their aggregate wealth on weapons. They're certainly not engaging in total war or anything like that. I've not been to Moscow for several years now, not since 2018. I've not visited Russia since 2018. But people who've been there more recently, people who have been there since the start of the special military operation, people whom we have interviewed on the Duran, they all tell us the same thing. If you go to Russia today, you see the civilian economy not only still existing, but actually growing. You see shops full of goods, economic activity, extremely resilient, all of this happening without stress. No sign of any kind of total war economy operating in Russia at all. The trouble with these kind of comments, as I've said previously, is that they not only distort understanding, but they probably distort decision making as well. They almost certainly will lead to the idea that Russia can somehow be outlasted, and because of course sustaining a total war economy in peacetime is all but impossible. And of course, in terms of the way in which Hamish sets it out, if the Russians really were spending 30% of their GDP, presumably, on war production, then the only way that would make sense would be if they really were planning some kind of a war against the West. It would really be Germany in the 1930s all over again, which of course it is not. Attrition, the whole attrition strategy that the Russians are following is based upon long-term thinking. It is precisely to avoid getting into wartime mobilization strategies of the sort that Hamish is talking about. It is precisely intended to deplete Ukrainian and Western resources as far as possible, whilst conserving Russian. And it is working. But there we go. That's Hamish. Maybe I'm spending too much time on him. He's made all kinds of claims and predictions about the kind of things that the Russians would do before, about the way in which the fighting would go. I think it'd be unfair, actually, and rather unkind to go over the many claims and predictions that Hamish has made, and many of the things that he said over the course of this war, which have turned out to be completely and profoundly wrong. Suffice to say that talk of tractor factories and 30% of wealth in Russia being committed to arms production and total war operating there is fantastical. It is not grounded in fact, and it shows a complete failure to understand the very sophisticated political and military strategy in this conflict that the Russians are actually conducting. Now, before I finish this video, I want to just turn to two topics. We're getting a little bit more information now about the latest meeting, which apparently took place in Malta, which was brought together by Jake Sullivan, in which the United States and the G7 powers have been trying to win over more and more of the global South states to try to get them to change their approach to the war, to try to get them to back Zelensky's plan, which essentially calls for a total capitulation of Russia. And it seems that the way that this has been couched to the countries of the global south is that it all focuses on defending Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the Western powers have been trying to argue that the only way to do that is by, in effect, backing Zelensky's peace plan. Now, apparently, the extreme secrecy in which this meeting was conducted, this latest meeting was conducted, secrecy that was commented upon by Sergei Lavrov in an interview that I discussed a couple of videos ago, that was actually agreed and insisted upon by the West in the hope that they might, through this secrecy, be able to get some of the global south countries to be more willing to make at least rhetorical concessions to the Western and Ukrainian position than they have been prepared to do up to now. In reality, as Lavrov says, what actually happens is that those countries that turn up to these meetings then come along and brief the Russians fully about what actually happened at those meetings. Anyway, we're now getting some indications as to who turned up and who didn't. And it turns out that China, this time, refused to go. I have heard that Brazil also refused to turn up this time. And the UAE definitely did not go. Saudi Arabia and India did attend, but the Saudis and the Indians, as always, proved deeply skeptical and unconvinced about all of these proposals and suggestions that were being made to them by the Western powers. And of course, all of this happened on the eve of Indian Foreign Minister Jai Shankar's 5-day visit to Moscow, the very extensive discussions that took place over the course of that visit, and of course the preparations for the visit of Prime Minister Modi to Moscow, which apparently those discussions are now underway. And a couple of videos ago, I again also discussed how President Putin, in his opening statement, in his meeting with Foreign Minister Jaishankar, before the substantive discussions took place, which of course were secret. Anyway, President Putin told Jaishankar that there would be matters that they would brief the Indians about, which have not been discussed publicly by the Russians up to now, and about the meeting that the Russians had been urged to make in Europe. I've already discussed how I suspect that there has been some kind of outreach to the Russians by some European politician, and I've speculated that it might have been President Macron of France. But anyway, it is clear to me that all of this exchange took place principally in the context of the Indians briefing the Russians about this meeting in Malta, and the Russians providing their own thoughts to the Indians and explaining to the Indians what the actual state of play in the negotiations really is. So there we go. An interesting thing. It does look to me as if this entire process launched back, I seem to recall, in July. Very much, as I said, in my opinion, in anticipation of a successful Ukrainian offensive in the summer, launched by Jake Sullivan, that this whole process is now edging towards collapse. Fewer and fewer global south countries are turning up. China, as I said, emphatically did not come to this particular meeting. That does seem to be clear. More and more countries are staying away. The UAE probably stayed away. Perhaps Brazil stayed away also. So that is all I wanted to say on that front. The other thing I want to say is that we are now seeing further signs of economic and political stress in Europe. There's massive farmers' protests in Germany. On the back of those that we've already seen in the Netherlands, and by the way, in Poland as well. And of course, there is now a governmental crisis in France, where President Macron has engineered the fall, the dismissal, or rather the forced resignation of his prime minister, and seems to be trying in some way to reconstitute the French government amidst warnings that France is going to enter some kind of austerity period. Warnings from the French finance minister that this is so. And all of this ultimately is connected to the deepening economic problems in Europe, which are, of course, also connected ultimately to the war in Ukraine. But the one thing that comes over clearly from all of these moves in Germany, in France, and wherever, is that the political class in these countries, or at least those people who are still ultimately in control, the Rainbow Coalition in Germany, the CDU-CSU, which will ultimately replace them if or when this current government falls, the new government that's about to be recreated in France. They are not going to change the underlying policies to any extent or to any degree. Support for Ukraine will remain as solid as always. In fact, the French government is now talking about stepping up deliveries of Scalp missiles to Ukraine. They're apparently intending to supply another 85. So all of these government reshuffles, governmental crises, protests, they all look like things rattling around inside the ship after it hits the iceberg and is already sinking. There is no real thinking going on in Europe, in Ukraine, in the United States either. We're all stuck in the same policies as always. That remains true for the conflict in Ukraine. It remains equally true over the conflict in the Middle East. Apparently, President Obama, or former President Obama, has had a meeting with President Biden, no doubt perhaps trying to change his mind on some aspects of policy. But I doubt that even that is going to make any difference. And besides, I wonder what real ideas Barack Obama actually has. But everything will continue, or so it seems to me, as always, even as, at least in Ukraine, the strategy of aggressive attrition the Russians are conducting continues to take its toll and leads us ultimately to the inevitable result. Well, there we are. That's my program for today. More from me soon. Just to say, I haven't discussed the situation in the battlefronts today. Relatively little news coming through, but all of it consistent with more Russian advances in every part of the battlefront. As Shoigu says, the Russians continue to retain the strategic initiative. So there we go. Aggressive attrition, no Western response. Western leaders unable to formulate new ideas, some of them frozen in outdated thinking of tractor factories and such like. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where we're now having a sale, 15% sale on t-shirts, and also, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon, with more battlefield updates and more about the situation in the Middle East and elsewhere. In the meantime, all that remains is for me to wish you a very good day and to say that, of course, I will be back soon. Thank you again. Have a very good day and see you once more tomorrow.